Okay, first, welcome everybody for this second lecture of today regarding privacy. And I just would like to remind you that we will have the questions at the end of the lecture, and you can write them via chat and I will read them later, and or you can raise your hand and then I will give you your turn. So thank you very much for joining, Andrzej. I think the floor is yours, so whenever you want, you can start.
Thank you very much, Maria. I hope my slides are coming through okay. My name is Andrzej Nowak, and like you, I'm a privacy enthusiast. So in this second lecture in terms of academic training, we will discuss what is the current state of privacy. So yesterday we've looked at a little bit, we've looked at the history of privacy and where the concerns around privacy and identity are coming from. And today we will look a little bit more at the current state. And just before we dive into that, I wanted to quickly rewind to a few concepts that are important from yesterday, but that we didn't maybe discuss in sufficient detail. And I wanted to tell them why they're important and what the implication would be. So it's going to be I think, bit of a busy and dense lecture. I hope you can manage to squeeze out an hour of your attention before lunch. And as Maria said, let's take the lectures let's take the questions at the end. I'm very happy to answer any of those and stay with you well past the allocated time if you like. So yesterday we spoke a lot about the history of privacy, how we got to this point, and we've spoken briefly about the fact that certain laws were enacted to guard privacy. And in the 1600s, there was this doctrine in the UK that my house is my castle. So they would say not even the king can enter a private person's home. So there was a very strong understanding of, let's say, private property and the private sphere, and it was not necessarily taken for granted. Then later on in the 1700s, for example, in the US Constitution, there were laws added that protected from unnecessary or unreasonable searches. And the thing is that at that time, searches obviously invaded physical space. But then what happens today if we have a law like that, but the search invades the digital space? So for example, is the police able to take your phone and then start searching it when they are searching your car for something, for example, because they may have a suspicion that you've committed a crime? And so, if we want answers to that, of course, we can look at the US, who are superstars when it comes to litigation and are a little bit ahead of the times in terms of some of the problems that might emerge. And the US Supreme Court is definitely experienced in digging in such cases. So for example, when they were asked whether a police can search your phone without a warrant, the answer was no. Whether they can track you by GPS 24/7, the answer was no, again, without a warrant. But then they can take your DNA because the assumption is that you don't have an expectation of privacy when it comes to that. And on top of that, the DNA that they would normally take and retain would be some junk DNA that would be, not necessarily indicative of your properties as a person. So that's very interesting because it means that we are using relatively old legislation that is not, or laws that is not necessarily up to the times, and we try to interpret it in a way which is going to give us answers about what we need today. Another example could be the fact that what is written on an envelope of a letter was treated as more public information than what was inside. So today, when you look at emails, for example, metadata that's associated with the email, so for example, the recipient, the dates, and so on, are treated as information that is less sensitive than what is contained inside the letter. And that's a very big statement that was made a very long time ago, but now we apply it to something that is more current. And then, several other acts emerged, such as, for example, the Declaration of Human Rights, which also contains a provision on privacy, the Data Protection Directive in the EU, which was a protoplast of the General Data Protection Regulation that has entered into force a few years ago and really fundamentally changed the world. So I would say that despite of the fact that we have to click these banners of cookies and so on, we are still going to a better place with that than if we didn't have that. Now, another important aspect I wanted to discuss in the context of privacy is that of the Panopticon. So the Panopticon is a construction that could be a building, that demonstrates how the law can cut both ways when it comes to privacy. So we spoke about the laws that could protect our privacy, but here we have a proposition of an object or a building where you could place a single person in the center of that building, and they would be able to observe simultaneously all the rooms and all the inmates that you have in that building. And so this is an example that's really liked by privacy advocates, and for a very good reason, because it applies an inspection principle to the inmates, but it should also be, of course, applied to the managers. So the question becomes, who is watching the watchers? So this is what it looks like in practice. And this extremely powerful concept is useful to be discussed here, because it means that when you apply surveillance only at certain times, you still get the effect of the surveillance almost constantly. And that's why it is a risk to society. So it could be corporations watching, it could be governments watching, it could be secret services, it could be the military during invasions, and so on. So this continuous application, but continuous action is something very powerful. So here I have a quote from Glenn Greenwald, who's one of the instrumental figures in many of the prominent leaks of the last 10 or 15 years. And he says that people make decisions that are not a byproduct of their own agency, but that are about the expectations that others have of them. And this means that when we are watched, our behavior significantly changes. We adapt towards conformist or compliant behavior. And this leads to a phenomenon called social cooling. And we'll look a little bit more at that in the third part during the lectures tomorrow. Now, the last quote I wanted to put around the Panopticon comes from Michel Foucault, who's one of the top philosophers of the 20th century. And he writes, hence the major effect of the Panopticon, to induce in the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. So to arrange things that the surveillance is permanent in its effects, even if it is discontinuous in its action. So that way you create a prison in your own mind. Society self-censors itself, becomes more conformist, becomes submissive, and that in turn promotes tyranny. I think nobody's fine with that. It leads to crippled freedoms, and freedoms very often are not measured by how those compliant are treated, but how those who oppose a system are treated, right? So we haven't spoken much about censorship, but it's still something that's pretty important. So I think that, kind of concludes the part that had to do with history. And now we can move to the part of where here is. So the question would be, where is here? We discussed yesterday, how did we get here? And now the question would be, where is here? Well, unfortunately, it is no longer about simply getting an ad for a lawnmower when you buy a house with a garden or something like that. That's really so 2005. It's not something you would see today. Surveillance and privacy have become much more complicated topics. So one of the very revered contemporary thinkers and historians is Yuval Noah Harari. I'm sure you've read many of his books. And he recently said something that relates very deeply to what we're discussing. And this is that dictators always dreamt about eliminating privacy, monitoring everyone, knowing everything you do, think, and feel. It is now possible. And that's, I think, a very powerful statement, because it says that the things that were not possible before became possible. So like in the example we discussed yesterday of the invention of the photo camera, we could easily imagine that the new possibilities lead to new challenges, and we have to adapt accordingly. So the world of today is a world where big corporations not only vacuum your personal data and coerce you into sharing it, but they also fail to control access to it, and then are unaccountable for the failures. And I think this is a major issue, because if someone takes your data, at the very least, they should be responsible for protecting it. And if we see news such as 500 million Facebook accounts are leaking out and posted on hacking websites, amongst the companies which are collecting the most private data about us, I see that as a very, very big red flag. And even Mark Zuckerberg, who's the CEO of Facebook, has been revealed to be on Signal, for example, it's been revealed that Facebook holds files on those who are not on Facebook and so on. So it's pretty scary, right? The data is not very well protected. And then that data is shared further. So it is distributed between those who want to buy it. So it is used by companies through glitches or not, such as, for example, that which was used by Cambridge Analytica and the run-up to the Brexit vote in the UK. And the funny thing is that it's not necessarily specifically Facebook. It is many other companies. For example, Google had a similar glitch in Google+, but they had fewer users, so maybe they were not that interesting of a target, right? So I think it's not even, it doesn't make sense to single out a specific company, just to say, this is something that happens and is going to happen more. And we should think of this fact and maybe, preempt the consequences before we really have to deal with the issues that come with. And then the files from Cambridge Analytica, for example, were used to support the Brexit vote, to tangibly influence real world events. And, these companies that were involved in this harvested profiles of real people. They performed micro-targeting, telling you exactly what you needed to hear to be convinced of an idea. And it only has to work some of the time. It doesn't have to work for everyone. Only if it works some of the time is already very good. So they've published, I think, 1.5 billion ads targeting 7 million voters. And normally, nothing is wrong with targeted ads. But then you see that the company who was involved in this got 40% of the money. So the data company got 40% of the money that were involved in this. So later, Cambridge Analytica was found to not have taken part in the Brexit vote campaign. Nevertheless, the technology and the ability to do that emerged from that system, right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg. This is what you can see. This is what's in the press. But unfortunately, it's abusing our trust and gullibility for what you could call psychological warfare. And I think that's an issue. So here we have a quote from Carol Cadwallader from The Observer, and she says, "This is Britain in 2017, a Britain that increasingly looks like a managed democracy paid for by a US billionaire using military-style technology delivered by Facebook and enabled by us." And I think this is something that's not really such a surprising quote. So, to understand a bit better how we got here, I would like to propose that we have a little poll. So in the chat on Zoom, I'm going to paste a little link, and you can try to go to that link and vote on the following question. Which % of web users do you think understand cookie policies? So very good, we see results coming in. I feel a sense of dread and pessimism in you. All right, results still coming in. Let's give it maybe 20 more seconds. All right, looks like most of you have voted. So universally across the board, we are pessimistic about this, right? And you are right. A study by LoopMe found that 15% of the consumers in the US and 18% of consumers in the UK understand how their data is used. So a third of Americans and then about a half of Brits don't even read cookie policies. So, that thing is essentially fiction, right? It doesn't touch on the average person. And I think that's already a very interesting thing to think about. So let's move on. This kind of targeting for political purposes is actually not something new. In the 60s, there was a company called Simulmatics. It was a US company that created a machine that could simulate voters. It was called the People Machine. So the machine would collect data, it would detect patterns in the data, it would create targeting and make predictions, and then you could create an influence. You could take direct action in order to take, to act on what the machine is suggesting to you. So it would chop voters into 480 categories. And for example, when Kennedy was running his campaign, he got 3 reports from that machine. There were reports from that machine around the war in Vietnam and so on. So the efficiency of that machine maybe was dubious, but the idea existed already 60 years ago. And maybe the computers were slow, maybe the models were too coarse, the data was too poor, but the idea was there. And the way that we would use it was exactly the way that we use it today. So Some have rejected the help of that machine at the time, saying that it is immoral and it should be illegal. So it's very interesting that there was such a strong, very strong opposition to that. So if you're interested in that machine, you can read a text called If Then by Jill Lepore on NPR. Very interesting. So how is this all happening? Well, obviously there's technology involved, because we've seen that, you know, these machines and AI algorithms and so on are deeply involved in this, but also there's a question of incentives, which we mentioned on the first page. So basically, why would somebody want your data, right? How did this happen? How did they get the data? And why would they want it? So we'll touch on two things. We'll touch on the development of technology, and we'll touch on the incentives that drive behaviors that are detrimental to privacy. So the phrase surveillance capitalism was coined by Shoshana Zuboff, which wrote a seminal book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. The book is relatively militant and it's a little bit dramatic, but I think you get the idea. It sets the mood, and I think things are going more and more in that direction. So in a way, she's focused on the money-making part of the problem, and she includes 7 paragraphs in the definition of surveillance capitalism. I just took the first one because I think it really applied the most to what we're discussing here. And that is a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. So far we are lucky because this has been applied mostly to advertising, but it slowly creeps into banking, insurance, healthcare, government, and so on. Google leaders have gone on record saying that if more people shared their health data, it would be possible to cure diseases sooner. And I generally agree with that, but how we share the data and with whom, I think, is extremely sensitive. And Google is not the first company I would choose to share my health data with. But I think we are trending towards a place where that will possibly become almost obligatory. Now, whether that's good or not, that's a separate discussion. But I think that this is something that could certainly come in the future, right, in a sort of public good way. And it is up to us then to steer that. I'm not advocating for it, but I'm, let's say, predicting that this is a discussion that we're going to have. So, it all stems from, this question of our value of privacy on one side, the convenience and money on the other. And you probably remember this famous phrase, if you're not paying, then it means you're the product. And I think to a large extent that is true in terms of many of the services that we're using. The good news is that we are a very, very valuable product. And I think we should keep that in mind. So, if we take quotes from Google or Facebook CEOs, so for example, Eric Schmidt said in 2009, if you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. So that's a pretty chilling quote to have from, a CEO of a company that's operating on a lot of your data, and that, kind of makes it clear what the stance was at the time. So I think it's something useful to think about, right? That position. And Google is a very powerful company. They are extremely, extremely good at technology, and they have an offline copy of the internet, including any web pages that you may have made, and so on. And this comment is pretty big, coming from a person who blacklisted CNET, for example, for publishing publicly his salary, neighborhood, political donations, and hobbies. All of that was gathered using the searches of the company that he's leading, which is Google. So I think there is, a kind of double standard applied here, and I think that we can do a little bit better than that. And then we have another quote from Mark Zuckerberg, also in 2009, and he said that people have really gotten comfortable not only sharing more information and different kinds, but more openly and with more people. That social norm is just something that has evolved over time. And the sad part about it, in my opinion, is that one of these guys is right. And unfortunately, I think that Mark Zuckerberg is right. Privacy has evolved to a point where the social norm has really changed. We are okay with doing many things that we wouldn't have thought were possible before. And we did that, I think, without a deep thought of what that implicates. And also, that's a little bit why we're thinking about all this. So, you could connect this to the trend of internet detectives that, for example, exist on internet forums such as Reddit and others. And for instance, when there were the terrorist attacks in Boston in 2013, the internet banded together to find those responsible from publicly available intelligence, and then falsely accused a 22-year-old student, and then mobbed his family with phone calls the sister of that person was accused of helping, and so on. Then, you could take another example, Britney Spears appearing to a group of her followers saying that she's being held captive, and that public pressure has led to changes in the way that her life is being managed. I would say that we have nothing to do with the life of Britney Spears and we should leave her alone. But nevertheless, it became a public discourse and it became public pressure that came from all this information being available. And if you go on the dark web, you can buy files either on tons of people or even on a specific person. You can buy doxing services, which are going to go and look out for someone, and kind of internet detectives will collect that information through ethical or not ethical, through lawful or not lawful means. And I'm not even mentioning, manipulated photos and things like that. So I think it's time to have another poll. And I would like to ask you at this point, let's try to move on. How much do you think it costs to get a black market Polish passport? So you can go to the same link where you were before and start voting. All right, let's give it maybe 15 more seconds. I see that's coming out. All right, so you are banding towards 1,000 or less. That is optimistic. I think that would be a great price. So you can see that a Polish passport on the dark web today costs about $3,800. It used to cost $4,000 last year. So the price decreased a little bit despite the inflation. So good news for those who would want to obtain it. Of course, I do not recommend it because that would be certainly illegal. You should obtain it through legal means. Now, so I'm going to pause this poll. Thank you very much for voting. How do we know this? Well, there's an organization called Privacy Affairs that monitors the prices on the dark web, and you can find fascinating reports online that not only look at the prices for various shady things on the dark web during a year, but also compare them to they produce reports of changes year over year and so on. So it's a bit of a digression, but I wanted to illustrate, how industrialized the data market has become, whether legal or not. It became really, really challenging to avoid being caught in one of these. And you see that prices generally started going down, right? So for 1,000 likes or followers, you pay a few bucks. For millions of emails, you actually pay more today than you used to pay before. I guess that's because now they are more qualified than they were in the past. Denial of service attacks are much cheaper, so 1/3 cheaper. Hacked Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Gmail accounts became cheaper as well. Cloned credit cards with pins cost $20, very, very cheap. A US selfie with an ID, maybe a bit more expensive. A scan of a passport, a Russian passport, for example, $100. Then credit card details with a card balance up to $5,000 costs half of what it cost in 2021. And then crypto accounts also went down in price a lot. So it's very interesting because it shows you that not only there's a ton of illegally obtained information on the web, but we have absolutely no control. And there is now a flourishing market that emerged, and there are privacy organizations monitoring that market. So I'm starting to think that this almost should go into the future part of this talk, because it really feels like we're living a certain type of dystopia. And the funniest thing I found about this study is that the cloned credit cards cost maybe 25 or $20. But if you want to use American Express, that's a $10 premium. So they charge more for American Express cards. Okay, so, why do we have this stuff? Well, it kind of is implied that the information that we share is considered fair game. So basically, if we put something online, then we have a ton of different privacy policies and special provisions and agreements and so on that say, well, if you put something out there, it probably, can be sold or resold, or the conditions will change without our knowledge at some point, and then that information is going to be sold anyway, right? So I think the law and the application of the law still has to catch up a little bit on that. But it's a classic that you have to accept the new terms of service to continue using the service. So it's free and, it's cool. That's very good. But practically, very often, we don't have a choice. So, for example, as a professional, can I afford to not have LinkedIn, which is a place where most of my, existing or future employers would verify my profile, right? It's a kind of public name card. So I don't feel that I have a choice to not have it. So in a way, we're not going to focus that much in this talk on the data that we reveal willingly, unfortunately, but it's a still very interesting topic. And I think that we should keep in mind that, just because we did something does not mean that we fully agree. And we will see an example a little bit later that illustrates that more vividly. So then there's this typical question, okay, yeah, our privacy policy, so please read it and so on. I want to ask you another question on the poll, and that question will be, which level of education do you think is needed to understand the average privacy policy? So you can vote again using the same link that was pasted in the chat. All right, excellent. I think we have the results. So it looks like, many of you would say, okay, it's something probably between a graduate and high school degree. So it means that if a person is reasonably educated in, let's say, mathematics, logic, the language that they speak, they should be able to understand it. But, if you look at how many people and in which countries have a high school or graduate degree, you will see that that percentage is very small, right? In many countries, it is well below 10%. So obviously, already that excludes the populations of those countries from understanding what's going on. But unfortunately, it's more complicated than that. So the reason why very often we share so much data without fully understanding what's going on is because it's actually a postgraduate degree that is required. So the option that was not voted that much, but that becomes true. So this is a study done by the University of Texas, Austin, if I'm not mistaken. And basically, these guys have concluded that a postgraduate degree is required to comprehend most privacy policies. The privacy policies can change any time. And the main issue is that the continued use of a service constitutes acceptance. So for example, my bank has sent me a new banking card. It's slightly different from the one that I had before. And they've charged me a certain amount of money for renewing that card. And they've sent me also the new privacy policy that is associated with that card, which is way more invasive than the one that we previously had. So I said, well, I don't want to use this card and I'm not okay with that. And they said, no problem, send it back. And when I wanted my money back, unfortunately, that was not possible. So whether this is legal or not, I don't know. But this is one example of how you're being treated. You don't have to use that, but you've already paid for it, right? So in a way, you're being roped into the system, and you have to then go look for help in places where you don't normally look, with federations of consumers or lawyers and so on. So what's the conclusion here? We don't have a lot of awareness about what's going on, and especially we don't have the capability of fully comprehending that, and therefore we have no control. So we really lose a lot of that, just flying out the window. I think this is one of the main risks. This is not accessible, and that problem is not fully understood for various reasons. So let's dive a little bit into technology. What do we fear, or what are the maybe manifestations of this kind of tracking of the issues that we're talking about, and so on. So we will just look at a very, very small slice of tracking, which is web tracking, and we'll briefly discuss what that implicates or what is the meaning, and then when we use the internet, what happens. So typically the way it works is that first we would be associated with a unique tag in context in some way. So let's say you're browsing the web, and then some tag would be put on your terminal that you're using. Then that information is stored, it is correlated, it is annotated with extra information, it's enriched offline, and then possibly it will be retrieved when the tag is encountered again, and then the context that has been added would be applied in order to obtain profit. So even if you're just browsing the web, that happens with every click you make today. Every major website, newspaper that you might read and so on is doing that, is tracing this, and they will explain to you, okay, this is happening for your benefit. But the main part that I find very troubling is the second point, which is that information is being stored, correlated, annotated, and enriched offline. So if one newspaper knows that I'm reading something, maybe for me, for my threat model, this is not necessarily a big issue. But if that information is then connected to the fact that I've purchased something some time ago, and then perhaps I have some illness, and then yet something else, that becomes way, way, way too much for comfort, right? So how technically, how is that done? Well, first of all, cookies, I guess you've all heard about them. These are little bits of information that are stored on your computer in the browser, and they get resent to the server when you come back to the website or when you go to another website sometimes. So typically today, websites would tell you, well, if you don't like cookies, just switch them off in your browser and then things may no longer work, but that's not really our problem. You know, figure it out, but you can do it in the browser, right? And very often you find that approach. Then you have third-party cookies. So those that may come from other parties. The browser storage and cache could also be places where things could be left for pickup later. And there are several other places. And then you have more sophisticated mechanisms, such as, for example, super cookies that may be set by your internet service provider. And by the way, in America, in the US, there were fines issued to telecommunications providers for setting those cookies. I think Verizon got like, you know, a slap on the wrist with $1,300,000 or something like that. But basically, you know, ISPs generally shouldn't be setting them. The internet service provider could be logging your access. They could be fingerprinting your browser. So without knowing who you are from the properties you transmit, they would understand who you are. You know, they would log your IP, the addresses that you visit, the unique IDs associated with the clicks, track you across devices, perform lookups of the hosts that you want to see, and then remember what you wanted to see. They put tracking pixels, JavaScript scripts, and so on. So the point is not at all to make an exhaustive list of these technologies. The point is just to show you that there's a lot, and it is difficult to find any one of them, right? So we are kind of on the losing side. One time I was trying to, you know, read privacy policies in detail. This is simply impossible for a human. I quickly got to the point where to read an article in a major newspaper, I needed to accept cookies and privacy terms from 741 different vendors that were not linked to each other. You would have to look for the privacy policies yourself. They wouldn't even be linked from the cookie choice dialog, and only 200 of over the 700 cookies you could disable with one click, and the rest you would have to disable manually or go to the webpage of each of the provider. So, you know, humanly, this is really not serious, and we don't even have, you know, digital agents to help us with that. We have, of course, ad blockers and tracker blockers, but that is an ongoing fight, right? And ongoing war. And, you know, these things happen all across different services. It's not just on the web. There was a case where a user found that all of his files that were used, that he was uploading to a popular backup service, had their file names and sizes sent to Facebook in a tracking script. So basically, you know, one of these toolkits that you had in an app would be sending that information. So you could treat it as an honest mistake. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't know, but I would prefer not to have that problem, right? So none of this adds value to you other than giving some business some kind of advantage. And sometimes it's an advantage over you, sometimes it's an advantage over another business, but it is that transfer of control and power that we have been discussing earlier. Okay, so what can we do? Well, you know, Google, for example, offers you this kind of screen that you see on the right where you can switch off the cookies, and it is presented in a way of switching of functionality. So the cookie is tied also to the functionality that the site provides you. Of course, Google is not a charity. They must get something in return from you for using the service. And naturally, if it is for free, then they have to get some data about you, right? This is the way it works. So the way it's presented is not in terms of, let's say, protecting your privacy or, you know, the individual, but it's more about turning off features. So, you know, the average person would see this and would think, hey, do I want to have bad search results? Do I want to have my YouTube history switched off? Of course not. I want that. So they're going to click yes, I want that once, and they will never think about it. And, you know, if you really wanted to get rid of it, then they would tell you, well, actually, you should block cookies yourself. And to be really safe, you should download an add-on that they made that will then tell those sites that you don't want to be tracked, right? Which is an issue. Well, that's great, but then even if you would do that, then you would see that there's stuff like, for example, certain sites in the Google browser would be excluded from these settings, right? So that would mean that certain competitors of Google could be blocked, but then their websites would not be, despite of the setting that you would set yourself, right? So that's the practice that I think is not very transparent when we think about how we are interacting with digital services. You can make up your own mind. Then we also spoke briefly of looking up, the websites that we visit on the internet. But in fact, any host that has a name is going through the domain name servers or the domain name system. So it has a number, and that number then can be translated into a name or the other way around. So there are servers across the world which provide this service. But then who says today that these servers are not listening to what we want to look at, right? Because you are sending every number you want to visit or every host name you want to visit to that server to then translate that either to text or to a value. So this is a very simple example, but it illustrates how deep this goes. So over the internet, when you use the IP protocol, you would typically use that unless you just use IP numbers, which is generally something that an average person would never do, right? So there is a middleman in this connection, but they cannot really be trusted. So let's say we want to fix that, right? And we are willing to invest a little bit of effort. So we find out that our DNS, so the server which is translating that, is configured by the internet service provider. So they might be doing something with that. Okay, so I'm going to say, well, I'm not going to use their DNS. I will change the configuration to use another DNS server. Maybe that a friend recommended to me. Well, fine, then other DNS servers may listen too. So then, well, I will set up my own server and, I will cache all that information. And then I have a problem because I'm self-hosting something and this is complicated. It could get hacked. Is it on my network? Who's paying for the electricity of the server? Things like that. Maybe it's not very practical. Okay, so I come back to the original point and I want to use public DNS servers. I found one that is really good, but then most DNS requests are not encrypted. Someone might be listening. So then certain browsers or setups are able to use encryption there or can use DNS over HTTPS, so DNS over the protocol that is usually used for the web. But then that leads to more problems. And in fact, if you wanted to really defend yourself against this, you would then still go 3 layers deeper, into things like server name indication or, whether it's blocked in certain countries or not, and so on and so on. And most of that stuff is legal. Most of that stuff is either something we quote unquote agreed to, or it just simply cannot be avoided. And that's just to illustrate that even for very fundamental things we do on the internet, there's already multiple layers where these things could happen. And this is not a conspiracy theory. This is something that's very well documented and happening in many countries and is fully legal. And then the other part I wanted to talk to you about, in terms of technology, is that of browser fingerprints. So typically your browser, when it makes a request to a website, to a server, is going to send a lot of information. So it's going to send a certain string that identifies it. So for example, I would say, okay, I am on Windows and I'm using Firefox. And then my colleague would be on macOS and they're using Safari. And then yet another colleague might be on Linux and she's using a KDE browser or something like that, right? And that user agent string typically identifies already pretty well the browser that you are using, right? And then there's a lot of other information added, such as the time zone, the screen size, plugins you may have installed so that the website knows what kind of information they may or may not show you. There could be some kind of WebGL, graphical performance evaluation, what fonts you have installed, the number of cores on your machine, and so on. All that could be sent to the server officially to provide you with a better experience, right? So that the server knows what kind of content you can interpret, what kind of content you can understand. The issue is that the browser is not really isolating you well enough from the outside. So to provide you with these services, all of that potentially would be needed. So it's not a conspiracy. It's simply the technical way that it grew. The declaration was done in good faith. Just like when you look at many internet protocols, many of them were built in good faith. And, the assumption would be that we are reasonable beings and we do reasonable things. But all of that really spun out of control. So the web technology and your browser reveal a lot about you. And there is a there's a very interesting website from the EFF called Panopticon, and using Panopticon, you can find out how much information your browser is leaking about you. And this has progressively been improving in recent years across several major browsers. So fine, let's say we're not on the web. We are just using our phone. We are logged out. We have set up Android without a Google account, or we've managed to set up our iPhone from Apple that it is, relatively safe and so on. How much information does that send about us? Well, according to research, quite a lot. The information that you see here with check marks is information that's sent automatically by the operating system to the manufacturer after you've installed it. So it kind of registers a whole range of primary keys that can be used to identify you with the manufacturer immediately after you've installed the OS on the phone. And before you've, even when you're not logged in, that information is being sent, and it can identify you uniquely from many of these keys. So for example, the SIM card serial number, your phone number, your hardware serial number, your IMEI, all of these things can identify you uniquely. Just one is needed, but then when you tie them together, then you have just one in order to be able to kind of pull out the file. So if that information is already available, then what is there to stop services from asking about it explicitly when you use it? And that availability is certainly a technology issue today. If the information is available, it becomes very easy to share it. And then, if you look deeper into what information is being collected, there's been a lot said about Apple and how they are better for privacy than, for example, Google phones. I think it doesn't make sense to get into that discussion at this point. I just wanted to show you to give you an idea of what these companies are collecting with their devices and sending. So, for example, Apple collects all the information about your files and settings that are put in iCloud, which software you run and when, and that happens also on Mac computers to a certain extent, equipped with macOS, your mail, your location, the unique identifiers you shared, even random recordings of your surroundings to improve your experience. Of course, that's something that has been also documented to be leaking from many major providers. So, the fact that I find very disturbing is that, even when you want to turn location services on or off, the setting is located under privacy in the menu. And I'm asking myself, how is my location related to my privacy? I know where I am, and the GPS in my device is receiving data from GPS satellites, which are government objects, and they don't send that data anywhere. So how is my location related to privacy at all? And I find it very strange that, already that mental leap has been made by the developers who made the system, and that's where you should manage, whether you should turn on your location or not. So today, of course, location data is much more than just a GPS. That is improved by services provided by many companies. So for example, they can take the IDs of the cell phone towers you're connected to and give you an approximate location before the GPS fix occurs. And GPS fixes typically, depending on the conditions, can take a minute even to appear, right? So then iCloud, for example, would store your iMessages end-to-end encrypted, but then it stores also the decryption key. So one would wonder, what is the point of that, right? Or what threat model is applied to this kind of work? And then, in terms of improvements of Siri or any kind of assistance, this is being listened to. I think there are quite a few articles from 2019. Even there was a Guardian report about this. Siri was, for example, confusing the sound of a zipper with a gun trigger, right? So what could go wrong in a situation like that? And there have been cases of medical details, drug deals, or even worse things being discussed, and all of that randomly recorded and then sent to subcontractors where there is a high turnover. There's not much vetting. There's maybe not much fidelity either in terms of those jobs. So workers have a lot of autonomy. I'm not saying that this is not necessary. Sometimes we need to make certain sacrifices to improve technology. I personally wouldn't make them, but maybe there are those of you who would. But globally, I think you would agree that this represents a problem that has to be sorted out somehow. And Siri says, "I only listen when you're talking to me," and that's obviously not true. So the same happens with Amazon devices, or the same happens with Google devices. So Apple, as we said, was at some point, or still is considered to kind of fight a little bit more for privacy than you would see otherwise. And so, I told you that you're a valuable product, and I think this fight between Apple and Facebook around this identifier that Apple wanted to remove that would identify you easily. In fact, they didn't want to remove an identifier. What they wanted to do is to ask the person using the device, do you agree to send that identifier to the application that wants to track you? Yes or no? Just a very simple question. And that created a massive, massive reaction from Facebook, but also from others, because you are a very valuable product, right? Entire business models and companies are built around your willingness to share data. Facebook makes in the order of 40 billion per year from ad revenue. Google makes about 50 billion per year. That is an enormous amount of money. And all of that war is about a tiny little identifier that wouldn't even be removed. It would just be prepended with a question to you. Do you really want to send it out? And don't make a mistake. Apple is doing this for, first, control, to reinforce their position and their platform as an intermediary. And second, they do it for profit because they themselves can also sell ads if needed. And they can force apps to use subscriptions, which you have to get from the Apple Store, which Apple gets a cut from. So at the end, there is money, right? At the end of the line, there is money. And the Apple Store is a monopoly. So, for example, the European Union has been looking a little bit at whether these monopolies can be opened up or cut up. But the Play Store is also a virtual monopoly. I think in the Google ecosystem, you can install custom apps a little bit more easily. I would call it a little bit more open, but then there are other issues that others point out around it, right? So if you don't use those stores, your device is severely limited. You can't buy apps elsewhere, and so on and so on. And then things like universal apps or progressive web apps haven't really spread to the point where they would be used outside of app stores. And so many users today decline access to app tracking, and there's already workarounds for this Apple change that they made. It is estimated that it cost Facebook around $12.8 billion in revenue, and then Snapchat lost over $500 million, Twitter 300 million, and then YouTube would have lost something like 2 or 2.2 billion just because of that little change, right? So that is a massive, massive implication, as you can see. And then, if we look at Google, what Google is collecting from Android phones, that's, of course, a very highly integrated ecosystem, which is technically excellent. And 85% of the phones in the world have Android on them. But because of this integration, it is very easy for Google then to extract that data, right? And whether you put something in the search engine or the Google crawler, whether you interact with the ad network, whether you have a device itself, it sends a lot of information as well. Then they have many other products such as Mail, a copy of Microsoft Office or Google Docs. There's affiliates that collect data for Google, third-party records. For example, Google Analytics is a service that you can employ on your website, and then Google gives you great pages, that allow you to understand how your audience is engaged with the web page, what is selling, what is not selling, and so on. But Google ingests all of that data as well. Remember, they have an offline copy of the internet. So it's a company that's very advanced, but also very powerful, right? So they have all your emails, all your files, and probably if you have your files there, you didn't encrypt them. So that may present an issue at some point down the line. And then there was always the question, okay, is Amazon, Google, and Apple listening to me? And the answer is yes, they're probably listening or recording snippets. But don't worry, listening to you is certainly not the most efficient way of learning things about you. And I have another positive piece of news. Third-party cookies are going to go away on Google browsers. So all of that functionality will be now to some extent embedded on the server side, and it will be much harder to avoid it. So unfortunately, regardless of the joke, this is unsettling news. So, there's many pages on the web that kind of log these transgressions, whether it is for Google or somebody else. I think, there were many so-called, scandals or many pieces of news around that. There was news around Street View cars performing electronic surveillance. Then Google would say, yeah, we actually do collect the nearest cell tower, even when you switch off the location and even when you remove your SIM card. And then later, even if you switch location history off, it would still be tracked because in reality, you have to go to another setting, which is called web and app activity. But then that setting keeps changing places. So if you want to create a tutorial your grandma were to put it, you know, you would have to adapt it to that version of the phone that she would have, right, to switch it off. And then data collection would continue in private mode browsing. There were exceptions for the Google browser and so on. And every time the answer is the same. Oh, sorry, we made a mistake where we got caught and we're kind of, you know, not able to do that. And I think that, you know, many of these choices, these companies probably make consciously. And there is a certain limit of, I think, good faith that we can have in, you know, just making honest mistakes. And they just keep popping up and popping up. You know, there's a site called Creative Future that has a timeline of scandals related to Google, and I counted there, I think, over 90 items in the last 5 years, and so that is, I would say, quite a bit, right? So then there are lawsuits and there are fines and so on, but in the end, you know, everything that you have somehow is going out and is leaking, and that system that is supporting the free, quote unquote, usage of all these apps, you know, and excellent services, unfortunately has a very high human cost. So here we have an example of the web and app activity settings, and these settings keep obviously moving, and the guides you may produce today on how to disable it will be useless tomorrow. And then there was another interesting thing that came out of Google just very recently. So they basically would think, okay, so there was a lesson learned, maybe not necessarily. So now they're disabling the disabled setting for admins in Google Workspaces that would opt out their employees of web and app activity. So if you were an admin, you could have set that setting for everyone in your organization and say, okay, we're not going to track everybody. And Google said, we want to provide a good experience to everyone. So you know what, we're going to turn it on. And if anybody wants to turn it off, they have to do it themselves. And again, so it's going to be turned on automatically, you know, without your, let's say, knowledge or consent. And then if you want to disable it, every person in the organization would have to do it on their own. So it's helpfully reset to on, whatever you have thought before. And this issue is not related only to, let's say, I don't know, major services or phones, but it also has to do with apps. So you know that Google, Facebook, many other companies, Twitter as well, provide software development kits that are very often used inside apps to integrate certain functionalities. So for example, it's very easy to show a Google Maps map in your application, or it is easy to create a Facebook like or share button that later will immediately connect your Facebook account. So that creates a lot of convenience for users. But these kits do much more than just provide that functionality. They send an enormous amount of data back to these motherships, right? Back to Facebook, for example. And there were news organizations such as the New York Times that have investigated this, and they legally purchased a data set that was supposed to be anonymized. And they found that the data set concerned 12 million people and 50 billion pings or data points about those people. And that would be just one tiny data set out of a multitude of data sets. And all of that would come from the trackers that were embedded and are embedded still in the toolkits that are used very happily by developers across the world, because they make development costs much lower and they enable some of these apps in the first place. But as you see, there's a high cost associated with that. And that data that you could have, you know, inside your app could be sent suddenly to even 20 or 40 different companies. And examples of that were reported by the New York Times in 2017. So on average, an app has 6 trackers, and on average, a data broker has data on 700 million consumers. So that's research that published. You can find that, you know, this is obviously not a made up number. And the arguments are always the same. You consent to being tracked, the data is anonymous, and the data is secure. But the New York Times was able to identify the movements of military officials and Secret Service agents, for example, from the data that they have seen that was supposed to be completely anonymous. So obviously there are issues with that. And the anonymization of data is a massive topic and also a field of research in computer science that I think was not necessarily applied. So the claims don't really hold up. And you consented to something else when you gave your consent. And then the data, in any case, allows you to be identified, right? So I would say that's an issue. And then the third issue is that the data can be bought by others and is being aggregated, linked, and shared. So it's a real gray zone. And almost we could say the cat is out of the bag, right? In the sense that our data is out there, it is being transacted and traded. And even if we make it illegal, it will still be out there already. So the questions of consent, anonymity, and security are definitely major issues here. So we have an interesting quote here from William Staples, who is an expert on surveillance studies. And he writes, "The seduction of these consumer products is so powerful that it blinds us to the possibility that there is another way to get the benefits of the technology without the invasion of privacy. But there is," and Staples calls all these apps that we have today tiny brothers. So it's opposed to the big brother that you would have in 1984, but these apps are tiny brothers that collect little snippets, little pieces, and then these pieces are somehow collated into a gigantic digital view of you in the backstage, right? So obviously advertisers are willing to pay for targeting you better, and then trackers have an incentive to capture and share that information because it is going to be to bring them money. And then we have an incentive to get things done. So we want to see businesses on maps. We want to evaluate the reputation. And again, this is not to complain about the service of Facebook or Google or Amazon or Microsoft, because again, these are very competent, technically advanced services, and they have grown out of the ad-supported model. But I think you see that in these points, things really definitely go too far, right? We have to be very mindful of what we are subscribing to and where we are retaining control or not. And that's, I think, one of the major issues that we have to ask ourselves: are these trade-offs worth it? Well, even if we make these choices consciously, we are still sometimes tricked by so-called dark patterns. So dark patterns are tricks used in websites and apps that make you do things that you didn't mean to, like buying something or signing up for something. So essentially, it's about constructing deceptive user experiences. They can take advantage of this by making a page look like it is saying one thing when it is in reality saying another. And dark patterns, which are very deceptive, grew out of three things. First, these were deceptive experiences in retail that kind of, were, let's say, continued for a very long time, since many years. So the second thing that was very useful was research that was done on psychology and nudges. If you're interested in that, I do recommend you read the book by Kahneman, on Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And then the third main point that contributed to the emergence of dark patterns was so-called growth hacking. And this exists everywhere. For example, my garage refuses to send me confirmation for appointments because I opted out of all their stupid newsletters, right? So if I don't want to receive the newsletter, I'm not going to receive a confirmation of the appointment that I've just taken with the garage, because they said, you refuse to receive email. But I refused to receive commercial email. I didn't refuse to receive an email that is telling me when I'm supposed to appear with my car, right? So it's an all or nothing approach that is really dangerous, and it makes you want to give up and stop fighting and let it come. And that's the essence of dark patterns as well. So one example could be a roach motel. So here I have an example from Verizon where you have an obligatory pass through an automated agent that advises you to call a hotline and then transfers you, and you have to convince a real agent of what's really going on with your issue, right? So they create barriers that are not really necessary for you to reach an agent. Then there's another pattern, which is called confirm shaming. For example, they say either you want to join Amazon Prime, or they tell you, no, thanks, I don't want unlimited one-day delivery. I don't want fun things. I don't want convenience, right? So it's like you have to click, yeah, I don't like convenience. Obviously, this is something that is ethically questionable, right? They're guilt tripping you in that phrase. Another interesting pattern is forced action. So for instance, Windows does that all the time when they apply updates. The only choice you have is to shut down an update or restart an update, but there's nothing else that you can do, right? So, well, if you know about it, you probably will switch off these updates, but then you have to perform them manually and remember. So again, it creates a major inconvenience, and you have to do things, let's say, the way that it's been designed by them. And then there's nagging. So for example, on the iPhone, there are these notifications very often that appear that tell you to either turn on notifications or not now, which means the notification is going to come back at some point, right? And then another pattern that would be interesting would be trick questions. So there, when you subscribe for a magazine or you want something from a magazine, you see Condé Nast, which is a major publisher, asking you things, and it is tiny text, and it is so complicated that when I first read it, I had to read it 3 times. And basically they say, well, we're going to send you emails, we do not want you to miss out, but if you would prefer to not hear from us, then tick here. But then our partners have relevant offers. If you would like to receive them, then tick here. And then if you would not want to receive the other offered by post, then untick it, right? So there's many negations, and in the end, you don't know if you're supposed to tick the box or not. And even from a design point of view, this is horrible, right? Any designer worth their salt will never agree to publishing something like that. But it increases engagement and it increases your revenue. And then, even search results are a question, right? So whether you can recognize organic real results or not is a big question, right? So you don't know in a display like this whether you're looking at ads or whether you're looking at something that is actually a page that is trying to give you the information that you're looking for. So you don't know what's real any longer. And then you have devices. So for instance, the Nest device, which is a very cool thermostat that you can put in your home, and it's intelligent. It adapts the cooling and heating in your home to what you need. It's hardware, it's connected to the internet, and therefore it can be hacked. So there were many examples of speakers listening, but there are much more outrageous examples. For example, for instance, there were cases of LG washing machines that would download 1 gigabyte after you connect them to the internet. Why does my washing machine need to download 1 gigabyte of information from the internet? Is the firmware of that machine really that big? Is this an update? Is this something else? I have no idea, but it freaks me out because it's an enormous amount of data. So, a lot of regulation came to kind of try to remedy this problem. There was the Data Protection Directive and Gdpr in the EU. I still think, regardless of the negative press it's getting, Gdpr is an excellent law. I think it's terribly applied, but it's an excellent law. And it's very interesting because it's extraterritorial. So it means that if you're an EU subject, then that law applies to you, even if another country is providing you with a service. So for example, for those of you who live in Switzerland, that's very interesting because Swiss data protection laws are quite different from those that would be in the EU. They're compatible to a large extent, but then there are many things that may be a little bit more flexible in Swiss law. So if you're an EU citizen, then EU law should apply to you. And there are notions of very fundamental things, such as consent, retraction, the right to be forgotten, the processors of data. There are enormous liabilities and fines being promised. So far, the fines paid for that are not very high, and I would say that this is one of the main issues: this enforcement and then application of the law. Nevertheless, it's very interesting, and it really changed worldwide the way that we interact with privacy and with things. And then there was this question: okay, so if the EU is harder on data protection and is protecting citizens more, and then the US is more pro-business and they want to enable sharing of the data officially to push services and kind of innovation and so on, how do we make sure that we can exchange data between those two very advanced jurisdictions and not make a mess? So what they created initially was a so-called safe harbor, which was almost a joke. It was a self-certification scheme where you would say, yeah, I'm protecting data, it's all good, don't worry. And then the regulator would say, well, we're glad you told us because we were worried, so thanks a lot. And then that was struck down by an Austrian activist, Max Schrems, who has sued Facebook in Ireland for sending his data to the US. And it was determined that the US did not provide adequate protection, and that invalidated the whole law. So the US government wanted to participate in the case, which is quite unusual. They couldn't, and it was a giant drama. And then we had the Privacy Shield, which was basically a replacement of that. So the Privacy Shield basically was protecting you from keeping your data safe. So again, Schrems sued that and invalidated the Privacy Shield. So for several years, this was invalidated, and it is still officially the state now. But now they want to apply a kind of Privacy Shield 2.0. There was a political declaration from the EU and the US recently, the political declaration of will to introduce a new data sharing scheme, and the text is being drafted. So again, there could be a few months before the text appears and then goes through the legislation process and so on. So, this will not stop. This is going to keep coming, and we can only hope that Max Schrems is going to have a lot of energy to combat that as well if the provisions there are unfavorable to privacy. And then on top of that, if Max Schrems doesn't have the energy, somebody else will. And as a society, we'll be able to defend ourselves against that. So that regulation sometimes actually yields results. So for example, this is a webpage from Google that you see in Switzerland when you want to use one of their services. So again, you're kind of switching off features, but in reality, you're opting out of cookies and so on. And that is going to be changed. And it took just one thing to change that. And that was a fine from the French regulators to the tune of 150 million euros. So the laws sometimes do have an effect. And the new page is going to look like this. So this is going to be test driven in France. It's already announced by Google. And basically, it will be a kind of accept all, reject all, or possibly choose your options if you want to. So now I have another question for you. So this is going to be a two-part poll again. And I wanted to check with you, the following. Which percent of users do you think click to accept all cookies? So which percentage of users would agree to that? So if you go back to the page that is posted in the chat, you'll be able to participate in the poll. All right, I think the voting is pretty much done. So you are saying, well, probably more than 60%. And the research shows that 90% of users, more than 90% of users click to accept all cookies. So now I have another question for you. The question is, what percentage of users do actually want them? All right, here we go. You think probably almost no one. That's correct. Only 3% of users want those cookies, right? So we're doing something to get rid of the annoyance, to give us access to what we really need. And we don't very often have the capability to understand what is being done, and we don't have the ability to refuse that, right? So it's an issue. It's an issue that's not necessarily specific to Google. It's just an example of a fine that had an effect. But if you look a little bit wider, you will see that kind of pop-up appear pretty much anywhere, right? And we don't have the time to read 700 privacy policies to see a specific website or to see a specific piece of news. So that, I think, is a major issue. And by the way, this study was done by an organization called None of Your Business, so NYOB. If you want to know more, you can go to noyb.eu. All right, and then we have this opposition, right, of privacy versus safety. Okay, if you don't reveal some data, then I don't know, criminals or terrorists might sneak through and so on. But what I would like to promote is much more privacy and safety. And the question then is, what is the power of governments, right? The regulation question takes us in a way to the power of governments around surveillance. And the conversation does focus very often in that domain on this privacy versus safety question, which we could twist a little bit and say, in fact, we're talking about privacy and safety. So you're probably very well aware that there were many issues with the National Security Agency spying on Americans, which they are not allowed to do. There are many very good books about that. It could be the Puzzle Palace or the Shadow Factory. So instead of reading that, you may want to read also or hear what Ed Snowden has said or published with Glenn Greenwald when these guys were smuggling pen drives across borders and so on. So I think, that issue that came up then with the leaks from Edward Snowden made it so that he has to give talks on TED from a robot, right, from a prompter. And then he showed, for example, that federal judges were operating in secret and, amongst the 34,000 surveillance requests that the secret court was supposed to approve, only 11 were rejected, right? And these are very clever people and probably with good intentions. But again, many of us are being targeted today. So that's an issue. And on top of that, what's being used across the world, it really relates to an increasing algorithmic and AI presence, invasiveness, automation. We know that algorithms, are far from infallible. We know that there is bias built into those algorithms, either by accident or by the data that was fed to them. So basically garbage in or garbage out. And the question is, do we have even the right to oppose automation? Do we have the right to be anonymous, to preserve our privacy when AI is processing the information about us, and so on and so on. So there's lots of very good books around that that I will link in the backup on the last day. And then finally, with the proliferation of digital communication, encryption became a thing. We will speak about that a little bit later tomorrow. But these countries that you see on the map are the only ones which have some kind of general right to encryption. So you see that the vast majority of the world and the developed world does not have a law like that. And encryption is one of the most basic tools for protecting privacy from unwanted readers, right? That's an issue. And this then finally takes us to one of the last slides, so we're almost done, which is that relates to threat modeling. So you would ask yourself, okay, I've been told a ton of different things about privacy and so on, but what can I possibly do to make things better? Well, typically what you would do is start with modeling the threats that you have. And I would model them across axes on sophistication and the likelihood to target me, but you could create your own axis, right, and figure it out. And so then you might want to put different entities or actors that may be against you, adversaries. So this could be family members, this could be friends, this could be governments, black hat hackers, corporations, and so on. And then I would ask myself, well, where are they headed, or what is the trend? And then I would see, okay, my friends are probably kind of expanding their scope and they may not want to target me and they are becoming slightly more sophisticated, right? Maybe they want to find out what I told another friend about them or something like that, right? Maybe I'm a high school student and I'm very concerned about this. Then corporations, well, they are already very sophisticated, but they are more and more likely to target me. And then we have governments, which may not want to target me much more than before, but they definitely will become more sophisticated with time and so on. And then for each of those, I would have some kind of remedy. Well, my family members, I can probably protect from any curiosity with a screen lock. Then you could say, well, if I have friends, then I would protect my phone with a password. And if I'm in high school and I leave my phone on the desk, then nobody will be able to unlock it. And then if I have a government, trying to understand what I'm doing, I could use encryption. In a black hat case, well, probably I can do much. So I will just use and practice the best digital hygiene I can. And then finally, with corporations, maybe I want to produce multiple identities that I will give to any one corporation so they cannot link me to each other. So what should you do? Well, you can take things to the extreme, like everything. You can, do very extreme things, but first you would typically decide what is it that you want, get help and listen to experts. And there are some very good experts, that work at CERN and sometimes give talks, like, for example, Liviu Valsan, and I have a link to his talk in the backup of these slides. You may want to pay for your privacy with money, or you will pay in other ways. And do complain about the lack of respect for privacy. So, do make it vocal, make it a problem. And in technical terms, there's a long list of things that you could do that range from the least crazy at the top to the most crazy at the bottom. So you could very easily start, with using a different browser, using a different communicator, such as Signal or Element, and then you could move towards privacy-friendly cloud services. You could read some guides about privacy. Then if you want to commit even more time and you are more paranoid or more exposed, you may want to go towards firewalls for traffic that is actually outgoing. So the app cannot send information from your phone or from your computer to the mothership. You could switch to Linux. You could create virtual credit cards when you want to pay. And then finally, you could go dark with consumer electronics. So there's a very good B-sides talk about that as well. And if you want to do more than that, then I think you have to go live in a forest because it becomes very complicated. But be aware that all of these actions lead to privacy fatigue. So, the question is, why should I do this? So find a sweet spot that is going to be the best one for you. So I think we've answered the question of where here is. Here is a place where, unfortunately, we have very little control and there is little accountability for those who trespass our privacy and laws. We have an adversarial relationships with the providers of our services and very often with also those around us to some extent. We value typically convenience much higher than privacy, and the same goes for spending. So we value spending higher than we value privacy. Our adversaries are sophisticated, and they sometimes know us better than we know ourselves. But do realize that there is a very positive side of this, which is that all of these things, all of these services, all of these trackers essentially are competing for our attention. And if we divert our attention elsewhere, we are definitely able to retain that control and to have the final word on this. And I would really like to continue this conversation with you tomorrow and see how things could possibly evolve in the future. So thank you very much for listening. I apologize for running over time, and I'm very happy to take any questions you might have. And those of you who want to stay are very welcome to do so.
Hello, many thanks, Andrzej, again.
Thank you very much.
So, okay, if you have questions, I could see many comments during the slides that they were giving, but okay, I don't know. Okay, I will start with the questions if you start writing here. So, from Stavros, how can fingerprint be mitigated?
Right. So this is a very good question. I think, first of all, the information that you send from the browser can be controlled through either the type of browser that you choose or through the plugins that you choose. So what I would do is I would definitely install, privacy protectors from the store that is relevant to your browser. So for Chrome, it would be a different store, and for Firefox, it would be different. For Safari, it would be different, but you can install these extensions. And in some browsers, such as Firefox, you can set this information to be the minimum possible. You can use an extension such as the user agent string switcher, for example, and you can put Firefox in strict mode, where it's going to make an attempt to leak as little information as possible. And then I do recommend you also rewatch, if you haven't already, Liviu Valsen's talk. So the slides will be uploaded to Indico, and in the backup, you will find the link. I think Liviu makes an excellent job of informing you what technical steps could be taken to protect your privacy and how much does it cost in terms of effort and what the trade-offs are. So in this talk, I didn't really talk much about that. This is, maybe more general and oriented towards the incentives and motivations, but there's also a very technical side to that. And I would also like to say that if any of you are interested in doing something more, or possibly having some kind of a workshop, in which we could involve someone like Liviu if he's ready, then definitely do drop me a line at the email address which you see on the screen, and we can see what to do about that, if something practical could be of interest.
Indeed, that would be great, Andrzej, to count with Liviu as well with this. More questions? I don't see raised hands or questions here, so maybe I can go through the comments. Okay, for example, from Valeria, I think the concern about privacy also depends on the generation. For example, Generation Z are not so concerned about privacy as boomers, as all their life is documented via social media from their birth, and all the technologies like biometric identification is just a part of their life. Okay, yeah, the price.
Well, I definitely have a comment on that. I think it's an excellent point, and this is something that's missing from this talk, I think, and possibly could be there, but I think it's also a very sensitive subject, which has to do a lot with perceptions and the way that we see things from different perspectives today. So it is definitely true that, the generation that was before me thinks about it differently, and the generation that came after me thinks about this very differently as well. But it doesn't make our problems different. I think carrying less is one thing, but the problem is still there, right? And I would say that, over time, if there's a robot deciding whether we can get health insurance or not, that's going to affect everybody, right? And we all have an incentive to worry about that.
Exactly. I don't know if Valeria would like to say something. Okay, if not, I can see a raised hand from Isa. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for a nice talk. I would like to wonder, for example, when they are asking you whether to accept or decline, you click to some location. But in case of you have problem, how you can prove that you decline or accept, I mean, since there is no copy of that things in your local computer, how you can prove that you decline, for example, if they ask something about your privacy?
This is an excellent question. I don't have a clear answer to that, unfortunately. I think this is a question that should go to some jurists or lawyers or legal experts. As some of you pointed out, first of all, sometimes we just click the pop-up and we don't actually understand we accepted cookies, right? So it happens very fast. You haven't read it. And then another person pointed out, well, then maybe this should be considered a dark pattern. And I'm not sure if it's exactly a dark pattern. It just allows you to get rid of the problem quickly. I think it's a dark pattern if you don't have an option to reject those cookies as easily as you would accept them, right? So it has to be as easy to opt out as it is to opt in. And that's something that is written in European law. So if they don't offer you that option, then I would say it's a dark pattern. But then if you do have that option, then at least it's there, right? And I don't find cookie pop-ups necessarily very useful. But I do believe that, over time we will overcome this, right? With the correct type of implementation and application of the regulation, it will become better. So to come back to your question, Isa, unfortunately, I think you have to ask a lawyer or a jurist about this. I don't have a clear answer, but probably there are already, indications of how to collect proof in those cases. But I'm pretty certain that it would really depend strongly on the jurisdiction in which you're operating. As you know, we are applying sometimes very antiquated law to digital concepts. We're trying to make it good, but not every legal system is adapted to that. So it may also be that you're going to run into problems of this kind. So I really think it would depend on the jurisdiction.
I see, thank you.
Okay, so I think already Andrzej, answered the question, but also commented on the comments that were in the chat. So if there are no more questions, I think maybe we can stop here and we continue tomorrow. Is that
excellent?
Okay?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, Maria. Hello.
Caio?
I have a question for
Okay.
Andrzej. I'm sorry for the pronunciation.
Perfect. Thank you.
Just wondering, what data of hours are you collecting with this online poll?
What data I'm collecting? Excellent question. Very good, right? So you point out the fact that I am collecting information, right? And in fact, I got a recommendation from a very knowledgeable colleague. I'm not going to name them, not to put them on the spot. But this is one of the very few poll solutions that are the most private ones. It's a Swiss company. And that company claims to not collect any data beyond what you put there. And it claims also to not use that data for any other purposes than giving you that service. So in fact, I can delete this poll right after, and they should, we should never be able to see it. And certainly we shouldn't be able, I don't have any access to information about who clicked what, when, date, name, IP address, none of that is exposed, right? So if you want to go to the control panel of this thing, then you would see something like that. I'm just going to pump it up here, right? You provide the poll here, and then they inform you that you do not have, that no data is being retained for commercial purposes.
Yeah, no, thank you. I didn't think.
Good that you called me out on that, because
exactly.
we should definitely walk the road that we are on, right?
I didn't think any data was being collected. I checked out the services website, but I thought the question had to be asked. It was relevant.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, Caio, but I didn't see your raised hand. So
No, I didn't. It was a last second thing. I'm sorry for jumping in like that at the last second.
Don't worry, and thanks for joining. So as I say, see you tomorrow then. Andrzej, thank you very much again.
Thank you again for your participation. Looking forward to it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.